thank you very much, Susan, and I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to be here with me today. I am looking forward to a conversation on U.S. policy, and conversations mean that I'm not the only one who speaks. So I'm looking forward to your questions and to your comments. But again, I'd like to thank you all for taking time this morning to be here today. If you read my biography, I think the most salient point is that I have trouble holding a job. And so I'm trying to hang on to this one for as long as possible. But it's great to be here, and it's an exciting moment. It's an important moment in the Americas. There's a lot going on, and what I hope to be able to do today is kind of run through a couple of broad themes. I want to talk a little bit about kind of 2007 in review and kind of walk through what I thought we accomplished last year. Now that we're kind of well into 2008, kind of briefly lay out what I think our principal challenges are going to be in our policy towards the Americas in the remainder of this administration, and then talk a little bit about how, based on what we've accomplished and what we hope to accomplish this year, how we create what I call an enduring engagement in the Americas, how we make sure that U.S. engagement is sustainable over time and how our engagement has continuity to it. And then I wanted to just end briefly with just a few thoughts on the Americas, some reflections about what I call how you create an authentic diplomacy in the Americas, which is really about how you attempt to overcome rhetoric and ideology to focus on shared values and shared interests, to build an agenda for the Americas that has broad consensus and that has a potential for success over time. But I wanted to start briefly by kind of laying out what I consider to be kind of the context in which our diplomacy takes place. And it's a context that many of you are familiar with. I mean, from our point of view, this is a region that has gone through enormous transformation, which has moved from authoritarian governments to democratic governments, that has moved from closed economies to open economies, that has really begun to engage through trading with global markets, and that all of this has had a profound impact. But in many ways, the impact is most profound in the deepest and in some ways the most neglected corners of our societies, in the sense that the promise of democracy has been embraced by all the peoples of the Americas. And the promise of economic integration and the promise of market economies has also been embraced, even though there are still some out there who have differing understandings of what trading relationships are and what they mean. I think it's now well understood that we are in a hemisphere which is committed to democracy, and not just committed to democracy in political terms, not just committed to democracy in terms of a mechanism to transfer power or constitutional procedures to manage the relationships between institutions in a government, but also democracy in its social and its economic sense. In other words, a society, an economy, a country in which all members of society have access to the prosperity of that society, and all members of society feel they are part of a larger national project. And in this sense, democracy in the region is really about inclusion. It's really about inviting people to participate more broadly in their societies. And this is profoundly important from our point of view diplomatically, because governments are really being reshaped in a significant way. And what I mean by this is that as these societies democratize and as governments really reach a point where they are reflecting their citizenry, they're redefining national interests. And as they redefine national interests, they're redefining how they engage with each other. And this is a very kind of effervescent period diplomatically. We've seen a lot of it recently, whether it's investment disputes between Argentina and Uruguay, whether it's the recent border disputes between Colombia and Ecuador, whether it's a variety of disputes in the region. They are all about how democratic governments, which really are trying to redefine and represent their national interest, engage with partners that are in the same process. And in the process of doing this, how there can be confrontation and conflict, but how more importantly, I think, is that there is a new space for dialogue and a new space for diplomacy in a way that really didn't exist, I think, in a meaningful way previously. I mean, during the darker days of authoritarian governments in Latin America, governments really didn't speak to each other. They really were isolated in so many ways. But they're speaking to each other now in an almost constant and continual fashion through all kinds of different mechanisms. And as you look out across the hemisphere today, what's really striking is all of these integration mechanisms, all of these economic cooperation mechanisms and political dialogue mechanisms, whether it's Mercosur, whether it's the larger idea of a South American Union, whether it's the Andean Community, whether it's a Caribbean Single Common Market, whether it's CAFTA and the Central American Integration System, whether it's NAFTA, and I could go on and on. But these are all kind of creative initiatives, all of which are in formative stages, and all of which still have a lot of work in front of them as they try to identify which of these processes work and which are successful and which are not. But as we engage in this environment, I think what's most important for the United States is, number one, we be open to the potential of the region. We be open to the potential that these integration processes have, and that we try to make ourselves a useful partner, recognizing that we bring a unique perspective, we bring unique resources, and we also bring a unique influence, both globally but also within international financial institutions and elsewhere. And so, I mean, in this regard, we are operating diplomatically in a context in which things are effervescent. They're bubbling. But at the same time, we have channels of communication, we have means of dialogue, and we have institutional structures, both formally through the Organization of American States and the Inter-American System, but also informally through the Summit of the Americas process and all of the different institutions that have been created over time to talk these problems through. And I think ultimately this is going to be to the benefit of the Americas, and it's going to be to the benefit of the United States. And in that regard, as we look back kind of over 2007, from our point of view, this was an important year for the United States. 2006, as you recall, was a kind of a year of elections. There was something like 17 major elections throughout the hemisphere, if you count presidential elections and major legislative elections. And that's half the democracies of the Americas. And so really at the end of 2006, the region had worked through an important series of democratic events, had defined its leadership for the next bunch of years. And from our point of view, it had defined it in a pretty positive fashion. In other words, we came out of 2006 thinking that we were in good position to work with all of the elected governments in the hemisphere, if those governments were prepared to work with us. And as we engaged in 2007, we really saw it as what we called a year of engagement, or a year of commitment, in which we sought to work with our partners in the region to help them be successful, and to underscore our understanding first of the big issues that they face, and secondly, our willingness to put our political capital and our economic resources behind those issues. So these governments had a good chance of being successful as they engaged the big problems, recognizing that most of the big challenges this region faces are social. It's really about poverty, inequality, and social exclusion. And so we wanted to make clear that we are in a position to address those issues. And without kind of going into too much of a kind of historical treatise here, all of you are familiar with President Bush's trip to the region in March of 2007. The speech he gave to the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce just before that trip, in which he laid out a social justice agenda for the Americas that we wanted to be part of, and how he used that social justice agenda not just to make it clear to our partners throughout the region that we understood the dramatic social issues and development issues that they faced, but also that we were prepared to work with them, but also as an effort to educate the American people. It was an effort, during a period in which the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan have absorbed so many people's attention, to remind Americans that this is our neighborhood. This is where we live.